There's a country in Europe where the sea sits higher than the rooftops of entire neighborhoods, held back by nothing more than an earthen wall a few meters thick. Roughly a quarter of its entire landmass sits below sea level, some of it more than 6 meters down, land that, by any reasonable geological logic, should be permanently underwater. And yet, on that same impossible ground, close to 18 million people build their homes, raise their children, and go about ordinary daily life with a level of calm that borders on total indifference to the catastrophe technically hovering just above their heads. This is the Netherlands, and the real story here was never really about defeating the sea. It's about what happens when an entire nation decides, generation after generation, to keep negotiating with it instead. Picture a country so flat and so low that cargo ships appear to glide directly above the rooftops of houses when viewed from certain angles. The water level in nearby canals sitting higher than the streets and homes just beyond the dike wall separating them. Picture roughly a quarter of that entire nation's land sitting below sea level, protected from total inundation by a centuries-old system of dikes, pumps, and floodgates that has to keep working without fail, every single day, forever. And picture a disaster in the middle of the 20th century so severe it killed close to 2,000 people in a single night. A tragedy that reshaped the country's entire relationship with water permanently. How does an entire nation build a stable, prosperous life on ground this precarious? Let's find out. To understand the Netherlands, you first have to abandon the idea that its landscape is simply natural. Much of it isn't. Roughly 26% of the country's total land area sits below sea level today, and historians estimate that at least 10% of that low-lying ground was already below sea level even before large-scale human intervention began. Low, boggy terrain naturally prone to flooding long before anyone thought to drain it deliberately. Broader flood risk mapping suggests the danger zone extends even further, with well over half the country's total territory theoretically vulnerable to flooding under severe enough storm or river conditions, even if not every acre within that zone sits permanently below the waterline day to day. The country's lowest point sits nearly 7 meters below sea level, and roughly 21% of the Dutch population, several million people, live on land that technically sits beneath the surface of the surrounding sea, protected only by an extensive, continuously maintained system of dikes, dunes, and pumping stations. Major cities including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Delft sit either partly or substantially within this reclaimed below sea level territory, meaning some of the country's largest, most economically vital urban centers exist entirely because of deliberate, sustained human engineering rather than any accident of favorable geography. Drive along certain stretches of Dutch highway, and the effect becomes almost surreal. Look up toward a nearby canal or river, and an ocean-going cargo ship can appear to glide past at a height noticeably above the rooftops of the houses sitting just beyond the embankment. An everyday visual reminder, largely ignored by residents who have simply grown up with it, of exactly how much elevation separates dry land from the water being held carefully at bay just a few meters away. That engineering didn't begin with modern machinery or 20th century technology. It began remarkably early, with medieval farming communities along the Dutch coast who, as far back as the 12th and 13th centuries, started building small earthen dikes to protect existing farmland from flooding, and gradually, over subsequent centuries, expanded those efforts into deliberately draining and reclaiming entirely new stretches of land from lakes, marshes, and shallow coastal water. Reclaimed sections of land created this way became known as polders, drained and enclosed parcels kept dry through a continuous, active process of pumping out water that would otherwise simply flow back in, given the chance. Windmills, serving for centuries as the primary mechanical means of lifting that water up and out before electric and diesel pumps eventually took over the job in more recent history. The iconic windmill silhouette that still draws tourists to villages like Kinderdijk today, originally built for purely functional drainage purposes, rather than any picturesque intent at all. Managing this constant, coordinated drainage effort required genuine cooperation among entire communities living along the same stretch of vulnerable coastline, since a dike that failed in one section threatened everyone living behind it, not just the individual landowner responsible for that particular stretch. Out of that shared vulnerability emerged one of the Netherlands' oldest and most distinctive institutions, the waterschappen, or water boards, regional bodies established as far back as the 12th and 13th centuries, specifically to manage local water levels, maintain dikes, and enforce a simple foundational principle that has echoed through Dutch civic life for nearly 1,000 years, that anyone who benefited from protection against the water also carried a genuine shared responsibility to help maintain it, a principle enforced historically through direct financial contribution and labor obligations, tied specifically to how much land a given household or farm actually stood to lose. That system of cooperative water management, refined and formalized over centuries, still functions today, the waterschappen remaining among the oldest continuously operating democratic institutions anywhere in the world, predating the modern Dutch national government itself by centuries, complete with their own elected boards and dedicated tax levies, still collected specifically for water management purposes to this day. But no amount of historical cooperation could fully prepare the country for what happened on the night of the 31st of January 1953. A powerful North Sea storm combining with an unusually high spring tide drove seawater against the Dutch coastline with a force the existing dike system simply wasn't built to withstand. Multiple dikes failed simultaneously across the southwestern Netherlands in the middle of the night, catching entire sleeping communities completely by surprise, water rising so quickly in some low-lying villages that families found themselves climbing onto rooftops in freezing darkness with no realistic way to call for help until daylight finally allowed rescue boats and aircraft to locate them. The resulting flood killed more than 1,800 people, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, and forced widespread evacuations across a region that had, until that single catastrophic night, considered its existing flood defenses more than adequate. Entire farming communities losing not just their homes but the livestock and cultivated land their livelihoods had depended on for generations. The scale of that tragedy fundamentally changed how the Dutch approached water management going forward, shifting the entire national mindset from incremental, localized protection toward a coordinated national-scale engineering response. Beginning in 1954 and continuing for nearly half a century, the Netherlands undertook construction of the Delta Works, an interconnected system of dams, sluices, storm surge barriers, and dikes specifically designed to dramatically shorten the country's exposed coastline and make a repeat of the 1953 disaster essentially impossible. The scale and sophistication of that undertaking earned it recognition from the American Society of Civil Engineers as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, placed alongside achievements like the Panama Canal and the Golden Gate Bridge, a genuinely remarkable distinction for a relatively small country to have earned through flood defense infrastructure alone, and one that transformed the Dutch approach to hydraulic engineering into a genuine export industry, with Dutch firms now consulted on flood management projects everywhere, from New Orleans to Jakarta to Venice. The centerpiece of that system, the Maeslantkering storm surge barrier protecting the entrance to Rotterdam's harbor, represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of automated infrastructure found anywhere in the world. 2 enormous curved steel gates, each roughly as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall, sit open under normal conditions to allow the constant flow of shipping traffic in and out of one of Europe's busiest ports. But when sensors detect that a dangerous storm surge is approaching, exceeding a predetermined threshold height, when those gates do close during a genuine storm, eyewitnesses describe an almost eerie transformation along the waterfront. Shipping traffic halted entirely, warning signals darkened, and a strange, heavy silence settling over a harbor that, just hours earlier, had been running at its usual relentless pace. That single barrier, out in the wider Delta Works system surrounding it, now protects not just Dutch lives and property, but a genuinely significant share of the entire European economy, since the port of Rotterdam handles more than half of all maritime cargo entering the continent, meaning a serious, sustained flood in the Netherlands could realistically disrupt supply chains, reaching deep into Germany, Belgium, France, and beyond within a matter of hours. Industrial regions as far away as Germany's Ruhr Valley depending directly on pipelines and river shipments running straight through this single, low-lying stretch of Dutch coastline. Even as it built increasingly sophisticated barriers to hold the sea back, the Netherlands simultaneously pursued an entirely different, equally ambitious project, creating brand new land where open water had stood before. The most dramatic example of that effort unfolded in the Zuider Zee, once a large, open inlet of the North Sea reaching deep into the country's interior. Beginning in the early 20th century and continuing across subsequent decades, Dutch engineers enclosed the Zuider Zee behind a massive dam, the Afsluitdijk, a barrier stretching more than 30 kilometers across open water and completed in 1932, transforming the saltwater inlet into a freshwater lake, and then systematically drained large sections of that lake to create entirely new, dry, cultivable land. The province of Flevoland, now home to functioning towns, farmland, roads, and tens of thousands of residents, didn't exist as dry ground at all before the 20th century. It is, quite literally, land manufactured from what used to be open sea, one of the most striking demonstrations anywhere in the world of just how directly the Dutch have been willing to reshape their own map, rather than simply accept the coastline nature handed them, an entire province, complete with its own cities, universities, and modern infrastructure, sitting on ground that a map from a century earlier would have shown as nothing but open water. That same relentless engineering shaped the country's cities from the ground up as well, sometimes in ways still visible in the crooked, tilting architecture of a place like Amsterdam. Beneath the city's famous canal houses lies a layer of soft, unstable marshland, ground far too weak to support the weight of substantial buildings on its own. Or early builders solved that problem by driving long wooden piles, sometimes more than 10 meters deep, down through the soft soil until they reached a stable layer of sand beneath, then constructing houses directly on top of that artificial wooden foundation. Entire buildings essentially balanced on a forest's worth of timber driven vertically into ground that would otherwise have swallowed them within a matter of years. Because property taxes were historically calculated based on how much street frontage a building occupied along the canal, merchants responded by building homes that were narrow and impossibly deep instead. Tall, slim structures with famously steep, narrow interior staircases, and distinctive hoisting hooks still visible at the top of many buildings today, originally installed specifically to haul large furniture up and in through the windows rather than attempt to navigate it up those same impossibly tight stairwells, a practice still very much in active use today whenever a modern resident needs to move a couch or a mattress into an upper floor apartment. Over the following centuries, as groundwater levels in the city gradually dropped, many of those original wooden support piles became partially exposed to open air and slowly began to rot, causing a noticeable number of Amsterdam's historic buildings to lean and tilt in ways still clearly visible along the city's most famous canals today. A subtle, centuries-old reminder that even the ground beneath a building, this old, was never entirely stable to begin with. As available land has grown increasingly scarce and expensive in recent decades, some Dutch communities have taken water-based adaptation even further, choosing to build directly on the water itself rather than simply defending against it. In neighborhoods like IJburg and Schoenschip in Amsterdam, entire clusters of floating homes now sit anchored to guide piles along the city's canals and waterways, each house resting on a hollow, buoyant concrete base that allows it to rise and fall gently with changing water levels while remaining securely fixed in place. Some of these homes, even prefabricated elsewhere and towed into position by boat, arriving at their final mooring already looking like fully finished houses rather than anything resembling a vessel. Because these structures have no foundation anchored directly into the ground below, builders have to carefully balance weight distribution throughout the interior to keep the entire home from tilting, and residents report that the gentle daily rise and fall of the water beneath them is barely perceptible at all, noticeable mainly during major storms or when a larger boat happens to pass close by, sending a faint, momentary vibration up through the floor. These floating homes maintain full electricity and clean water service through flexible connections designed specifically to move with the house, while wastewater is processed separately, in some developments even converted into biogas and reclaimed fertilizer. In Schoenschip specifically, dozens of households now generate their own electricity through rooftop solar panels, store surplus power in shared battery systems, and trade that excess energy among themselves through a coordinated local network, alongside sharing a small fleet of electric vehicles rather than each family maintaining its own private car, a genuinely forward-looking model of small-scale water-based community, living that Dutch architects and engineers have since exported to other flood-vulnerable regions of the world, including proposed floating developments as far away as the Maldives, where entire coastal communities face many of the same fundamental challenges the Dutch have now spent the better part of a century working to solve. None of this constant engineering effort has fully solved the country's underlying vulnerability, and Dutch officials are notably candid about that fact, rather than pretending otherwise. Continuous pumping, necessary to keep low-lying polders dry, causes the peat and clay soil beneath much of the country to gradually compress and sink even further over time. A slow-motion consequence sometimes described as digging a hole that quietly gets deeper the more effort goes into keeping it dry. Recognizing that concrete and engineering alone had reached practical limits in certain areas, the Netherlands has, in recent decades, adopted a genuinely different philosophy in select regions, a program known as Room for the River, which deliberately relocates certain dikes farther back from riverbanks and lowers adjacent land specifically to give floodwater more space to spread out safely during periods of high water, rather than attempting to hold every single drop back through ever taller, ever more expensive barriers. It represents a meaningful philosophical shift, an acknowledgement that the most sophisticated form of modern water management isn't necessarily about defeating the water entirely, but about knowing precisely when and where to strategically step back and coexist with it instead. Living on ground this deliberately engineered has shaped Dutch daily life and culture in genuinely distinctive ways. Cycling remains woven into nearly everything. Dedicated bike lanes, separated from vehicle traffic, running through virtually every city in town with entire parking facilities, including one in Utrecht, capable of holding more than 12,000 bicycles beside the central train station, built specifically to accommodate a population for whom biking to work, school, or the grocery store is simply the default, ordinary way to get somewhere, rather than a deliberate lifestyle choice. Parents bike their youngest children to school seated in front-mounted cargo bikes. Older kids pedal there independently once they're old enough. And commuters simply merge into the same steady flow of two-wheeled traffic each morning, regardless of weather, rain, or biting winter wind, rarely enough to keep a determined Dutch cyclist off the road entirely. That same practical, unpretentious sensibility carries into Dutch communication style as well. A culture generally comfortable, saying exactly what it thinks directly, treating straightforward honesty as a genuine form of respect rather than something requiring softening or elaborate diplomatic cushioning, a habit some trace back to a long mercantile history in which clear, efficient negotiation mattered considerably more than decorative small talk. Work culture reflects a similarly practical philosophy. The average Dutch work week runs close to 32 hours, among the shortest of any developed economy in the world. Part-time work widely accepted and normalized rather than viewed as a lesser professional path, particularly among parents balancing careers with raising children. Despite those comparatively short hours, the Netherlands consistently ranks among the most productive economies in the world when measured by output per hour worked, evidence that working fewer hours doesn't necessarily mean producing less, provided a society structures its expectations and institutions accordingly. At home, that same unhurried, grounded sensibility shows up in the Dutch concept of gezelligheid, a word without any precise, direct English translation, describing a particular feeling of warmth, coziness, and genuine togetherness, often reflected in the distinctly Dutch habit of leaving curtains wide open at night, interior lights left glowing visibly out onto the street, a custom frequently traced back to older Calvinist cultural roots, suggesting that a home with nothing to hide has no real reason to block the view from outside. Economically, the Netherlands has built remarkable strength directly out of the same constrained, engineered landscape that defines its physical geography. In the Westland region, vast stretches of glass greenhouses stretch toward the horizon, an industry that has transformed Dutch agriculture into one of the most technologically sophisticated food production systems anywhere on the planet. Sensors and automated climate control systems now adjusting temperature, humidity, and irrigation in real time, allowing the country to produce and export a genuinely disproportionate share of Europe's fresh vegetables and flowers from a landmass smaller than many individual American states. A nation roughly the size of Maryland somehow ranking among the largest agricultural exporters on Earth by value. Those same greenhouse operations generate meaningful amounts of electricity as well, combined heat and power systems supplying both the crops growing inside and a measurable share of the broader national grid. From there, goods flow directly toward Rotterdam, Europe's largest port, a highly automated logistics hub built substantially on land dredged and reclaimed from the seabed itself, where unmanned vehicles now navigate shipping containers through the terminal with only minimal direct human involvement. A single container unloaded from an arriving ship in the morning, often already loaded onto a barge or train bound deep into the European interior, before that same day is even over. Farther inland, the country has also become a genuinely critical player in one of the world's most advanced technology supply chains, home to the only company on Earth capable of manufacturing the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines essential to producing the most advanced computer chips currently made anywhere in the world. Machines weighing more than 150 tons, costing hundreds of millions of dollars apiece, and requiring engineering precision measured in mere nanometers. An entire global industry now quietly dependent on a small, specialized cluster of Dutch factories most people outside the industry have never even heard of. A combination of dense population, sophisticated engineering, and constrained physical space has produced real, ongoing tension as well. Tension the country has been forced to confront with growing urgency in recent years. In the summer of 2026, an unusually severe and sustained drought pushed the Netherlands' relationship with water into an uncomfortable, unfamiliar direction entirely. Water scarcity, rather than flooding suddenly dominating national headlines in a country whose entire identity has been built around the opposite problem for centuries. Water levels in the Rhine River fell to their lowest recorded levels in nearly 80 years, forcing cargo ships to carry lighter loads simply to avoid running aground, driving shipping costs upward and disrupting delivery schedules across the wider region that depends on that same river as a critical transport artery. Farmers in low-lying provinces were forced to harvest crops, including potatoes destined for major European fry supply chains, weeks earlier than normal, yielding noticeably smaller, less mature produce than the market expected, while some houseboats that normally floated freely on full canals were left sitting awkwardly on dry, cracked mud instead. In Westland's normally hyper-precise greenhouse operations, regional authorities took the unprecedented step of banning the use of surface water for irrigation entirely for the first time in the country's history, a restriction affecting well over 100 growers and threatening tens of millions of dollars in potential losses. By midsummer, the government had formally escalated its warning level from a risk of shortage to an active, declared water shortage. And by August, Even major cities, including Amsterdam and Utrecht, had introduced daytime restrictions on water usage, affecting well over 1 million residents, some municipalities halting park irrigation entirely, while making narrow exceptions only for trees old enough to have stood for decades, evidence of just how disorienting it felt for a country defined for centuries by having far too much water to suddenly be forced to ration what remained. Alongside that emerging water scarcity, a separate and equally persistent challenge continues to weigh on younger generations of Dutch residents in particular: housing. In major cities, renting even a modest room or purchasing a first home has become genuinely difficult, pushing growing numbers of young adults to remain living with parents well beyond when they might otherwise have moved out. While young families increasingly find themselves priced out of city centers entirely, forced to settle farther from urban job markets in search of anything remotely affordable, commutes stretching longer each year as the search for reasonably priced housing pushes buyers further from the country's economic core. The core problem isn't simply an overall shortage of available land, but the sheer number of competing demands placed on that same limited space at once. Housing pressed directly up against the ongoing needs of agriculture, nature preservation, and flood control infrastructure. Every new development effectively requiring a delicate, high contested balancing act among interests that all have entirely legitimate claims to the same small stretch of ground. A nationwide nitrogen emissions crisis tied closely to the country's large agricultural sector, the very industry that helps feed much of the rest of Europe, has further complicated that picture, triggering delays to numerous housing projects that would otherwise have exceeded newly tightened environmental limits, leaving home prices persistently high, even as the pace of new construction has struggled to keep genuine pace with demand, a genuinely uncomfortable bottleneck for a country that has spent centuries proving it can, quite literally, manufacture entire new stretches of usable land whenever the need arose. There's a real, almost poetic irony sitting at the heart of that housing shortage. Centuries ago, Dutch communities looked at open water and saw nothing but opportunity, an entire nation quite literally manufacturing new land from the sea in order to give itself more room to grow, to farm, and to build. Today, many of their descendants find themselves waiting years for the chance to live on that very same reclaimed, hard-won ground. A nation that spent centuries perfecting the art of creating space, now grappling, in a very different way, with exactly how to fairly share what it has left. And yet, despite the drought, despite the housing pressure, despite the ever-present structural risk that has never fully gone away and never realistically will, ordinary Dutch life continues to move at its familiar, remarkably unhurried pace. Bicycles still stream steadily across the bridges each morning and evening. Warm light still spills out from uncurtained windows along the canals after dark. Wind turbines keep turning steadily out across the open, flat countryside, generating power for a nation whose entire existence has always depended on carefully, continuously managing exactly what nature provides, rather than ever fully controlling it outright. Tourists still gather each spring to watch endless rows of tulips bloom across the northwest. Farmers still cut the blossoms away just weeks later to redirect the plant's energy back into the bulb. And city squares still fill each winter with markets selling hot, freshly made stroopwafels. Life carrying on with a kind of practiced, generational calm that would be difficult to imagine in a country less experienced at living directly alongside genuine, ever-present risk. Perhaps that, more than any single dam, barrier, or engineering marvel, is the real, quietly extraordinary achievement sitting at the heart of the Dutch story. Not that this remarkable country ever truly defeated the water surrounding and threatening it, but that generation after generation, it has simply kept finding new, inventive ways to keep living alongside it. If the Netherlands' extraordinary centuries-long relationship with water surprised you, subscribe, because there are more nations out there quietly rewriting the rules of what's supposed to be geographically possible.